I was standing at the polished entrance of the Pacific Crest sleeper, checking the premium manifest, when I saw the name booked into cabin 1, Mr. and Mrs. Grant Hollis. For 1 second, I assumed it was a clerical error, because my husband was supposed to be in Portland, not boarding my train with my surname attached. Then Grant appeared in a camel coat with a leather weekender in his hand, and Sienna Pike stepped up beside him in cream silk, like she had already practiced being seen there. He slowed the instant he recognized me, and that tiny break in his stride told me more than any confession ever could, because guilty men always notice the witness first. Sienna followed his eyes to my face, then to my uniform, then back to him, and her fingers closed around her bag strap hard enough to crease the leather. I lifted my scanner, kept my smile where the passengers behind them could still trust it, and said, "Good evening, Mr. Hollis," then looked at her ticket and added, "Ms. Pike, your cabin is ready." The silence that followed was not loud, but it was complete. The kind that settles when strangers realize they have just walked into somebody else's marriage. Grant leaned closer and tried for a quiet version of control, asking if we could talk. But I turned my body toward the aisle and told them boarding needed to keep moving. Sienna held her chin high for the people watching, yet she did not touch his arm again, because the manifest in my hand had just stripped her borrowed roll-off in public. I stepped aside and welcomed the next guest with the same even voice, while Grant and Sienna moved past me carrying a week of lies and matching luggage. When his shoulder came level with mine, I caught the scent of the cologne I bought him last Christmas and saw the corner of a resort itinerary sticking out of his passport wallet. By the time they reached cabin 1, I was still standing straight at the door, smiling for the next passenger, and my marriage was already over. From the outside, Grant and I looked like the kind of marriage people trusted on sight. The polished couple with waterfront views, dinner reservations, and a life that always photographed well. I worked overnight runs for Pacific Crest, and he produced food and wine festivals that let him move through expensive rooms with practiced ease. When people visited our condo, they saw clean counters, framed trips, his hand resting near mine, and a marriage arranged so neatly it almost defended him for me. I had spent 6 years becoming easy to live beside, the woman who replaced his espresso beans before he noticed and learned which silence meant fatigue instead of distance. Grant had learned to move inside that kindness without ever naming it, kissing my temple on the way out, thanking me for understanding, letting my patience carry weight that belonged to him. When Portland started appearing in his schedule more often than Seattle, always wrapped in client language and last-minute changes, I heard the repetition and kept choosing the safer interpretation. The signs never arrived dramatically enough to force a confrontation. Just small pieces that stayed behind. A dinner charge too late for a sponsor meeting. A bar receipt on a night he claimed exhaustion. Once, while he showered, his phone lit up on the counter with Sienna's name and the words, "I booked the upgrade." And when he came back, he turned the screen face down. Another night, I hugged him at our front door, caught a sweet floral perfume on his collar that did not belong to me, and watched him ask whether I could heat up leftovers. That same week, Elaine Mercer called me into her office and handed me my first premium sleeper assignment, a promotion I had worked toward long enough to stop talking about it out loud. I walked out holding the route packet, already planning to tell Grant over dinner, thinking something good had finally arrived at the right time. Instead, I boarded that train carrying the best news of my career, and he boarded it carrying a woman who already understood how much room my silence had made for her. By the time dinner service settled into its quiet rhythm, I had already seen enough inside cabin 1 to understand that Sienna was not improvising desire, she was executing access. Her cashmere wrap was folded over Grant's side of the seat like it belonged there, and the silver case on the table held monogrammed cards addressed to G and S. People do not arrive by accident with custom stationery, coordinated luggage, and the kind of relaxed eye contact that only comes after rehearsal, repetition, and private confidence together in public. When I returned with the first course, Sienna did not flinch at serving etiquette or shared space. She murmured, "This is better than Portland," and Grant smiled back at her. That one sentence landed harder than the affair itself, because Portland was the city he kept using at home whenever he needed distance, delay, or a clean lie from me. I set down their plates, noticed the resort itinerary half hidden beneath his passport wallet, and understood that my marriage had been funding logistics, not merely covering secrets for them. Later, while refreshing the cabin with evening turn-down amenities, I found a handwritten card tucked beside the bottled water. To the week we finally stop hiding from everyone for good. The handwriting was rounded, feminine, and deliberate. Exactly the same slanted script I had once seen flash across Grant's phone beside the words about booking the upgrade for him. An affair can still pretend to be reckless, but matching evidence never is. And by then, I knew Sienna had been helping him build the lie piece by piece deliberately. I heard them again after lights dimmed, his voice low, hers lighter, asking whether the sponsor dinner excuse would hold for one more weekend in Napa this fall too easily. He answered the way practiced people answer, not with surprise, but with timing. It always does. And that calm reply made her role impossible to misread for me any more then. I walked back to the pantry, opened my service notebook, and wrote 3 things in a straight line: Portland, the itinerary, and Sienna's active place inside it for proof. I kept serving Cabin 1 the way I had been trained to serve every premium guest, with steady hands, clean timing, and a voice that never asked the room to carry my pain. Grant watched me the way men watch a locked door after realizing the key no longer fits, while Sienna kept adjusting her posture like confidence could still be tailored back into place. I poured their wine, set their dessert spoons in order, and asked whether they needed anything else, giving them the one thing neither of them knew how to fight: complete composure. Grant tried first when Sienna stepped away to the washroom, leaning toward the aisle and lowering his voice, asking whether we could talk privately after my shift ended. I placed his coffee beside his right hand, looked at the wedding band still sitting on his finger, and answered, "I thought you were in Portland tonight." He said nothing after that, and the silence between us turned useful, because I could see the exact second he understood I was no longer asking him for anything. When Sienna returned, she studied my face for damage, for trembling, for some visible wound she could privately call weakness later. But all she found was the same measured expression. She smiled too brightly and asked for sparkling water, stretching the request into performance. And I brought it without touching the rim of her glass or meeting her halfway. The more ordinary I remained, the less secure she looked. Because people who enter someone else's marriage expecting a crown do not know what to do with dignity. The train moved south through the dark coastline, windows turning black enough to throw our reflections back at us. And each time I passed their cabin, I felt them tense. Grant stopped pretending to relax, and Sienna stopped pretending this was romantic, because secrecy had been doing half the work for them before I ever stepped onto that train. Near the end of service, I caught my reflection in the darkened glass outside the pantry and realized I did not look broken at all. Only done. At the Crew Hotel in Santa Barbara, I sat on the edge of the bed with my binder open and started separating pain from paperwork before they could blur. I photographed the handwritten card, the itinerary, the monogrammed cards, and the cabin manifest, because evidence looked steadier on a screen than it did inside memory. Then I called Naomi Briggs, gave her Grant's name, my county, our years together, and the shortest summary I had. He took his mistress on my train. Naomi did not waste words on comfort. She asked whether I felt safe, whether there were joint accounts, and whether Grant had access to property he could empty quickly. When I told her about the shared cards, the travel points, And the condo lease, she said. Good. Now, stop calling this shock and start treating it as timing. I opened a new account for my incoming pay, changed the passwords attached to my subscriptions, and made a list of everything that had only my name on it. I did not drain our joint balance, break a lease, or touch his devices, because revenge that begins with panic usually gives the liar somewhere easy to hide. I saved statements, flagged late restaurant charges, cross-checked dates against the Portland stories, and sent Naomi the images that tied Sienna to the trip itself. By the time the train reached its morning stop, Naomi had the filing details for King County and a draft strategy built around sequence, access, and provable misuse. Before trying to sleep, I took the dress Grant liked on me out of my suitcase, folded it once, and dropped it into the donation bag. It was not a dramatic act, just a quiet refusal to keep wearing any version of myself that had been arranged around his appetite and polished excuses. At sunrise, Owen Hart replied to an old reimbursement thread Grant had copied me on weeks earlier, asking for backup on charges that still did not reconcile. I forwarded that email to Naomi without commentary, because Owen's message did not accuse anyone of betrayal. It simply refused to make fiction look billable. While Grant was still south of me rehearsing whatever explanation he thought charm could rescue, my side of the story was already hardening into dates, files, and procedure. By noon, my grief had nowhere soft left to spill, so it did what disciplined things do instead. It stood up straight and got finally organized. Grant came back to Seattle expecting tears, questions, maybe one exhausted argument he could outwait, because men like him mistake delayed consequences for forgiveness far too often. What greeted him instead was service completed in the only language he had ever truly respected: documents with filing numbers, a quiet apartment, and a door no charm could reopen. Naomi had him formally served before sunset, and by the time he unlocked the condo, the marriage he thought he still inhabited had already become a case. I was not there when he stepped inside, but I knew exactly what he saw because I had arranged every absence with more honesty than he had given me in months. My books were gone from the living room shelves. My winter coat was gone from the entry closet, and the framed photos had been lifted cleanly from their hooks. On the kitchen counter, beside the ring I no longer intended to wear, I left one folded line in my handwriting. Portland was never the destination. He called before he reached the bedroom, then again from the elevator, then twice from the street, each voicemail sounding less offended and more unsteady. I did not answer, because Naomi had already instructed him that future communication belonged in writing, and for once his access to me came with procedure. By the next morning, his emails had turned from outrage to explanation, but none of them could change the simple sequence. He lied. He traveled. He used shared money. And I filed. At the same time, the rest of his life started tightening around details he used to assume would stay soft if spoken confidently enough in meetings. Owen Hart refused to approve several reimbursement requests tied to vendor hospitality, because the dates, destinations, and supporting receipts did not match any legitimate event schedule. Grant tried blaming clerical confusion, then vendor overlap, then Sienna's processing habits. But every version he offered still had to pass through the same numbers. Sienna learned that almost immediately, because once Owen pushed the files back, her own name stopped sounding glamorous and started sounding traceable in every forwarded thread. She called Grant 3 times during my layover, and though I never heard her voice directly, his reply came through one accidental voicemail. "Just stop panicking." That single sentence told me exactly what I needed, because people do not tell their co-conspirator to calm down unless the structure around them has already started shifting. 3 days later, Grant stood outside my building in a navy coat darkened by Seattle rain. Looking up at windows he no longer had any right to expect opening. He texted that we owed each other a conversation, but owing had ended the moment he spent our future, like it was his to reassign. I stayed inside, phone face down, while the city kept moving beneath the weather, and for the first time in years, his waiting happened somewhere I did not have to carry it. Grant still intended to stand on stage at the summer festival launch, smiling into microphones as if private deceit and public credibility could remain separated by tailored jackets forever. But Owen had already returned the reimbursement packet twice. And once those numbers stopped cooperating, sponsors began asking careful questions that charm could not answer for him anymore. The dates attached to vendor dinners missed actual event schedules. The travel categories blurred into leisure spending. And Sienna's approval trail appeared in places no romance should appear. I did not leak a single document or call a single friend, because clean paperwork moves through professional rooms faster than gossip and lands harder when it arrives. By the week of the launch, Grant was no longer defending his image from me. He was defending expense codes, signatures, timelines, and every polished explanation he'd given. Sienna went into the review meeting expecting discomfort, but not exposure. And the first time her name was read beside those charges, she lost color in the room. She had helped invent the false work language around the trip. So when finance asked for supporting detail, every answer only pulled her deeper into the same file. Grant called twice that morning, then texted that people were overreacting, and I could almost hear him trying to negotiate with facts the way he negotiated with women. I was across the city in a training room with Elaine Mercer, learning the premium service curriculum, when the festival livestream started muting itself on nearby phones around. Nobody announced scandal out loud, but the room understood something had cracked, because Grant's remarks were shortened. The expansion sponsor withdrew, and the applause arrived thin that night. I never saw his face on stage, only the clipped replay later. His smile too fixed, his shoulders too high, his confidence finally carrying visible strain for the camera. At the same hour, Elaine handed me the internal proofs for Pacific Crest's new premium campaign, and my own face looked back at me from the glossy prints. The photograph was simple, my uniform pressed, my posture easy, my expression steady, but it carried something I had not felt in months. Full possession of myself again. Grant thought he was escaping into a cleaner life when he boarded that train, but all he really did was push me toward mine before he could stop it. By the time the campaign went live, he had nowhere left to hide but inside consequences, and I had already stepped into brighter rooms with my name intact. Months later, the divorce moved forward through signatures, disclosures, and dates instead of tears, and that alone told me how completely my life had changed shape. Grant no longer reached me through charm, surprise, or guilt, because every path he once used now ended in written procedure, and the silence I kept. Sienna disappeared from his orbit the same way she entered it. Attached to convenience first, then gone, the moment convenience stopped paying for itself. I moved into a smaller apartment with better light, fewer rooms, and none of the heavy performance that had once made marriage look stable from outside. I slept through the night without listening for keys, stopped translating late texts into harmless explanations, and ate dinner without measuring whether somebody across from me was lying again. Elaine added training duties to my schedule. The campaign launched on schedule, and my own reflections started looking less like recovery than recognition. One afternoon, I passed my campaign image in the station concourse, paused for half a breath, and realized I was no longer checking whether I still looked valuable there. A passenger I remembered from an earlier run handed me a postcard and said, "You made a hard night easier," and I tucked it into my bag without needing anything more. I did not survive that marriage just to become grateful for escape. I left it, kept my name, kept my future, and never returned to the woman who stayed. Thank you for staying with me through this story. And if any part of it felt painfully familiar, I hope you remember peace can still belong to you. Like this video, share it with someone who needs that reminder, and subscribe for more stories that leave room for healing.